Hello, everyone. I hope you're doing well today. It is Christmas Eve for all those who celebrate, except for maybe in Australia, maybe Christmas Day now. Thank you all so much for joining me on this day. We are going to be talking about trauma, but of course, we're going to do it through a holiday lens, not surprisingly, because this is often a difficult time of the year for people who are dealing with trauma and, not necessarily having any level of family support or any support for that matter. And so today I want to kind of give us a space to talk about that because, there isn't a lot of that space out there. A lot of what we see around this time of year, it just doesn't support those who struggle. So that's what I'm going to do here today. I will say that while I have a topic for today, and I'll talk about it some, please feel free to ask me your questions. I'd love to have a discussion today, or just even if it's just sharing where you're at, like where you're at today, what you're dealing with. That's okay too. Whatever you would like to do. And in between those discussions, if we have gaps, I'll talk about my topic, but I'd love to have you guys share where you're at as well. I'm going to say hi to Trish. Thanks for being here. But I'm going to talk a little bit today about dealing with hopelessness. Hopelessness and particularly dealing with hopelessness around the holidays, but I'm also going to be very clear, which you may have already expected, and say this stuff works every day of the year. Okay, it's just that around this time we can have a tendency to be feeling a little worse when it comes to hopelessness. I want to say hi to Carol too. Thank you guys for being here. And hi Shabnam, good to see you too. So glad you are all joining me today. So today I'm going to talk about, a little bit about hopelessness. And again, this is a discussion to kind of fill in the gaps. You guys have things you want to talk about or, questions you want to ask or just things you just want to say. Please do. Okay. So my original plan was this would be more of a discussion, a Christmas Eve discussion, I guess you could say. But we could use it however you guys would like. But while we're doing that, I'll talk a little bit about kind of how we can deal with hopelessness. It's funny, my controller originally labeled this discussion fighting the hopelessness at the holidays instead of dealing with hopelessness at the holidays. Kind of a slightly different image, but very appropriate for the controller to say fighting, because that's what they do a lot of the time. They fight, right? They fight the emotions. They fight them. They push them back down where they belong. This is controller thinking they belong there. And don't let them come out. Like, don't let them come to the surface, right? Like, that's how the controller deals with emotion. Now, while that may work for a tiny bit of time, it isn't sustainable, right? Like, that is not an approach we want to invest in the long term. But I did think it was kind of funny when I was coming up with the title for today, and I heard fighting the hopelessness. I was like, well, there's my controller. So let's talk a little bit about some of the rules when it comes to dealing with hopelessness around the holidays, but also around most of the rest of the year. It's just kind of a little bit on steroids right now. So the first one I want to talk about is that it's critical for us to remember that hopelessness is not about now. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't a little bit of it that's about now. And I also want to stress that most of the time when we do have an emotion that comes up, it is triggered by what's happening now, but hopelessness is almost always about how we felt when we were younger, when we had less power Okay, I mean, let's face it, maybe no power. And we were really stuck or trapped in a highly traumatic situation. That doesn't mean that we aren't experiencing things today that trap us, hold us back in some ways, make us feel very stuck. But the difference in our power levels today compared to when we were children is very, very important for us to remember that as much as we possibly can, to remind ourselves of that. Because the controller is always going to be working really, really hard to make us think it's about today, which actually goes against the controller's greater purpose or their desire for us, because it can actually make the emotion much more detrimental on us and on our lives and like the decisions that we make. But the controller does often create their greatest fears. It's actually one of the big things about ego self. In general, which is what I refer to as the controller, they do have a tendency to manifest the very things that they are trying to avoid. And recognizing that is very, very helpful in our journey. So the first one, hopelessness is not about now, even if your controller is telling you that it is. Okay, keep that in mind. At least, even if you can separate out some of that hopelessness as being about the past, it is going to be helpful. It really is. So that's the first one I have for you today. The second one I want to talk about is that toxic positivity is a lie. And I specifically wanted to talk about this one today because around the holidays, I feel like toxic positivity just gets so much worse. Like it just feels like it grows an extra head or something. I don't know. But it's bad this time of year, right? Shabnam saying zoned out for a second, very telling. Yes, I was calling that controller out. So, and I will say that is usually when I call the controller out like that, especially on something that's so foundational to who they are. Yeah, they're going to zone, they're going to dissociate, they're going to go bye-bye, right? So great catch there, Shabnam. So toxic positivity is a lie. Don't overlay your hopeless thoughts with positive thoughts. Oh my gosh, there's like an entire industry that's based on this concept. Please stop. Don't do it to yourself, right? It is actually a form of self-invalidation when we take the hopeless thoughts and we go and we put this thing over it that just says, I'm fine, I'm good, it's not that bad, da da da. Okay. It doesn't do anything to help the hopelessness express and heal itself. Like it doesn't go anywhere. It just keeps it under wraps, or it keeps it shoved under the surface where it just continues to live and unfortunately manifest, right? Like it will literally manifest. So don't believe the hype about toxic positivity and do your best not to overlay the hopeless thoughts with positivity. We're going to probably do it a little bit. And sometimes this time of year, if we don't have the time to sit with what's going on in our system, we may want to kind of say something like, yeah, right now I'm doing this, but I'm going to get to you later. Like, yes, you could tell your system that. But just going, oh, I don't feel that way, I feel this way, that is always a bad idea. So please keep that in mind as you go through the holidays. But honestly, any time of year, this is going to potentially show up as an issue because it is all, this messaging is everywhere. Now, the good news is, there's also a lot of messaging that's showing up around toxic positivity, which is great. I love to see it. I love to see people say that isn't the right answer. And so that's also really powerful. But keep that in mind as you're going through the holiday season. The next one, get curious about your hopelessness, okay? What do I mean by that? One of the things that I've learned about parts is that they are highly evidence-based. Okay, now, granted, A lot of their evidence is based on the past. It's based on very specific people, like people who have been in our lives from the very beginning. It's based on probably a limited number of people in the scheme of things. It's not a very big number, generally speaking. But it is this evidence that they have gathered. Now, what they do with that evidence is they take it and they extrapolate it to the entire rest of the world. So it's not really, when I say they're evidence-based, it's not a particularly scientific approach. It's based on a very small sample and then extrapolated out to the rest of the world. But it is important for us to recognize that our parts are operating from cold hard facts in their opinion. This is evidence. They have seen these things play out. They have heard these things play out. So they are very sure that they are right. And so when we dismiss our hopelessness, like for example, when we put positive thoughts over our hopelessness, or we ignore it, or we pretend it's not there and we move on and we do something else, we are also ignoring evidence. Now, evidence will often show up in our system as memories. Now, these could be memories we do remember, and these could be memories we don't remember. But I can say that it is very important when we can for us to listen for the evidence. And those oftentimes will look like memories. The good news about this is then when we understand where the hopelessness is coming from, it dramatically increases our ability to be compassionate for the part that is holding that hopelessness. Because honestly, sometimes it can just feel like the hopelessness is getting in our way and slowing us down and not really helping us. And a lot of that is going to be the controller response to it. When we know what happened to create the hopelessness, it lets us give ourselves compassion, and it lets us put the anger we feel on the people that it belongs to, right? And a lot of times when we don't remember everything, we don't know to do that. So when we get curious about the hopelessness can also share its evidence with us. And that is where we can have some really transformational experiences as a part of our healing journey. So get curious, stay curious about your hopelessness. Ask about the evidence. What is it that has happened that is fueling this hopelessness? And when you get those answers, you will likely see a shift in how much hopelessness you feel. They really are deeply, deeply connected to each other. So that's the next one. So let's talk about this one, because this is a big one for a lot of us. And again, a lot of controller influence here that happens because, not wanting to face the hopelessness during the holidays. This one, don't ignore the triggers when you see traditional holiday images, okay? Don't invalidate the triggers that you are feeling with phrases like, I should be over it by now. Or this happened such a long time ago. Or, the favorite, the past is in the past. Okay, don't let yourself ignore the feelings that are coming up. Because I'll be honest, one of the hardest feelings in the system for us to validate is going to be grief. It's going to feel very vulnerable, something the controller never wants to feel. It's going to feel like a little bit like it's little kid-ish. Like there's usually grief is coming from our inner children. So it's going to feel, not like an adult, right? Because it isn't coming from the adult self. It's coming from the children who've been holding on to these deep losses for a long, long time. So, we're gonna struggle in the system, okay, to let ourselves hold space for that grief. Lots and lots and lots of parts are gonna come up and say, oh, this is silly, Why are we still worried about this? Why are we still triggered by this? Why are we still having a reaction to this? It's ridiculous. I'm an adult now. I can handle it. I've moved on with my life, and all of this stuff comes up when we start to feel, because we are seeing more traditional holiday images in whatever form. Could be almost anything, from movies to ads to social media posts. Doesn't really matter where it comes from, but it's there and it needs to be acknowledged, and we need to do our best to have enough self-compassion to hold space for that, because it's real. It's not made up. It didn't come out of nowhere. And the more compassion we have for ourselves, the better we can do with that. Now, with grief, I often say, sit with the grief. Don't shut it down. Don't intellectualize it. As a matter of fact, this is the one place, the only place, where I tell people don't write from it, actually. Because a lot of times when we write from the grief, we tend to start moving into that intellectualizing process that the controller loves to move into. And that will often involve statements like, well, why would I feel this way? It doesn't really make sense. And maybe I should figure out why I'm feeling this way and think about it. Maybe I need to think about it some more. That is the controller's response to grief some of the time. So instead, sit with it, ground into it. But if it's another emotion like hopelessness, which by the way is not the same as grief, but usually blocks it, definitely letting that hopelessness express, like, I'll never have this, life will never get better, everything's always going to be a disaster. These are things I hear from my own karma kid, who often holds the most hopelessness in our system. So let those things express. And when the controller attempts to kind of add a current story to that, like that hopelessness, like making it about now, do your best to keep bringing it back to the foundational message of hopelessness, because that's when you can start to see the evidence, right? That evidence I was talking about comes up when we move out of this mind space where we're creating a story around it and into the body-based emotion, which often is much more of a theme than specific, until that evidence and memory starts to show up. And then sometimes you can get really specific, but it's going to be about the past, right? So that's a complex concept. So if that didn't all make sense to you, that's okay. You can also ask questions about it here, or you can message me with questions too, like, know that that's available to you, because this is a challenging concept. The next one I want to talk about is do something to support your inner child or your inner teenager. Yes, I said teenager, because you're going to have both in your system, I promise. If you didn't get a chance to be a child, you also did not get a chance to be a teenager. And honestly, when I work with my clients, a lot of times we find that inner teenager is in just as much of a need of expressing and experiencing the life they never got to as the inner children. So keep that in mind. If you have an urge to do something that you never got to do, whether it is something you never got to do at the holidays or something you never got to do any time of the year, make some space for that. Don't make the entire holiday season about obligation, which is exactly what the controller often tries to do, right? They try to make it about obligation. So let yourself do something, maybe a little, well, your controller will call it silly. Controllers love to call these kinds of things silly or childish or unnecessary or a waste of time. I could go on and on and on. But what is it you want to do at the holidays that you never got to do at the holidays? And it can be even the silliest things, like having a movie night, right? It doesn't have to be something complex, something that's really expensive. Just doing something to take care of yourself. Maybe you want to go ice skating. Maybe you want to eat a particular type of food that is totally not the traditional food that maybe you never really liked, who knows? Or maybe you want to eat the traditional food because that is something your inner children have really latched onto. Whatever it may be, let yourself experience that, and don't let the controller come in and tell you you're not allowed to, or this isn't useful or helpful, and this isn't fulfilling any kind of obligation, or whatever it might be that they try to say. Okay, so give yourself that opportunity to, spend some time doing something for you, especially if you're spending time with family. Make sure I felt like a little bit of a broken record yesterday in a sense, because I felt like I kept saying to people over and over again, take some time for yourself, take some breaks. If you are spending time with family who can be abusive or can repeat trauma patterns with you, take time, step away, get in your own space, do what you can for yourself, write from your emotions, do those kind of things to help yourself out. Because if you're stuck in situations with people that do nothing but trigger you and re-traumatize you, give yourself some time. The truth is you're gonna be dissociated. It's just the bottom line. You're going to be dissociated. And you may also find yourself being pretty dissociated if you're alone. But if you're with people who have traumatized you, your controller is going to dissociate you. But do what you can to take some time for yourself during this next couple of days, especially around the holidays, the time when we are often with these family members. So that's what I have for you today. I can hold on the live stream for a few minutes if you guys have any questions, any comments, anything you want to say, kind of maybe get off of your chest, like anything that feels like it's making you really uncomfortable this time of year, or you're triggered right now, or you're struggling with a particular emotion, or struggling with a concept. Please, this is your opportunity to let that express, let it vent. Feel free to, say what you want to say around this time of year, and I'll kind of give you a few minutes here to express that. I know that every year I feel a little bit differently this time of year. Sometimes I go through like a really good holiday, and then the next holiday isn't as good again, and that is not because I'm going backwards. That's a really common belief this time of year. Not this time of year. All year long, from a standpoint of recovery work, we can often feel that if we have an emotion that we haven't had in a while, or if we have a tough time when we had been having a pretty easy time, the controller will often try to tell us that we're going backwards, because they see emotional healing as a very linear process. It is 100% not a linear process. We actually cycle and spiral and move all over the place, up and down, up and down, up and down. Generally, the trajectory, if you're into science and you were to scatter plot that thing, right, it would generally be moving in a positive direction, but you are going to have lots and lots of ups and downs. So, this year for me, the emotions have been, actually, I'll say, weirder than in the last couple of years. I don't even really know that I would describe them as good or bad, just unusual. And, yes, my controller wants to be like, that's because something's wrong. No, or something's wrong that's not usually wrong, whatever it is. So that isn't necessarily the case, but it has been an odd year for me. That's for sure. And I'm sure, hindsight being 2020 generally, that I'll figure out why, but I'm not going to figure it out right now. All of us saying, our Christmas day used to be very strict and timed. Now I'm just with my daughters. We are so happy doing our own thing when we choose to. No rules. You know, I do love the no rules plan. I love just doing whatever you want in the moment. I think that's a really beautiful thing when you can make that happen. Because yeah, we're really encouraged to live in this world where everything is like very time, like scheduled down to the minute. I know my controller loves to live that way. And if I let them live unfettered in their way, everything would be scheduled and timed all the time. So yeah, that's good. I'm glad you're experiencing that this year. Shabnam is saying hopelessness and grief. I didn't catch the difference. So thank you for asking about that. I will say that hopelessness and grief generally come from two different parts. And hopelessness is going to be more of a defensive emotion, which means a lot of times when we need to grieve, we feel hopeless instead. That's the block. Hopelessness is generally going to be an emotion that comes from the karma kid. So that's a defender. That's a part I talk about a lot. Sometimes I refer to this emotion as futility. I consider them to be the same thing. It's just to me, it's two different words to describe the same feeling. So that is going to be a karma kid feeling. And when we are surrounded by triggers this time of year that tell us we're not doing it right, that is a very, very common trigger for a karma kid. So that's why hopelessness can be higher this time of year. It might not, but it can be. Grief is going to be it's a very foundational emotion. It's generally coming from the inner children, and it is about losses. So the losses from childhood, the places where the inner children did not get their needs met. And unfortunately, there can be a lot of that, right? So the hopelessness will often be blocking the grief when it comes up, and the grief often comes up when inner children are reminded that there's something they never got. Again, that can be a really common thing this time of year. That's where those triggers come in, right? That's where we're watching the movies where everybody lives happily ever after, right? Those can tend to trigger the feelings of grief and the feelings of hopelessness, because I find that the hopelessness will often block the grief. So that's where the writing from the hopelessness can come in really handy for us to get to the grief, because the hopelessness really just sort of sits over top of it and blocks it. It's why people can move into depression for months and months and months. Like, it's because underneath it is grief that we don't want to feel. I think, honestly, hopelessness feels way worse than grief. But we, for whatever reason, our parts, I should say, believe that it's better to be in the hopelessness than to feel the grief. And a lot of that has to do with the conclusions they drew based on our childhood. Clearly as a child, it would have never been safe for you to feel that grief. And so your parts are still kind of confused about whether or not they can feel it now. So that's something that can keep us sort of stuck in that hopelessness. So when it comes, write from it. And then it may introduce you to some of that grief that needs to be felt from those inner children. So, yeah. So thank you guys so much for being with me today and for your comments, and for talking a little bit about what's happening for you. I am going to talk to you guys next Tuesday. I believe that'll be New Year's Eve. Yeah, I think it will. 7 days, right? So I will plan to talk to you guys next Tuesday, same time, same place. I hope you are doing okay, getting through the holiday experience, and remember that you are not alone. And that's one of the main reasons why I have my page. That's main reason why I do this work at all, is because we do need to feel like we, in fact, are not alone. So Thank you for being here. I will talk to you all after Christmas on New Year's Eve next Tuesday. Thank you all so much.